There are moments in life that split your timeline into two halves, the before and the after. For me, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I walked through my own front door and heard my 4-year-old daughter screaming in a way I had never heard before. Not the kind of scream that means she scraped her knee. Not the kind that means she dropped her ice cream. This was the kind of sound that comes from somewhere deep and terrified. The kind of cry that a small child lets out when they genuinely believe something horrible is about to happen to them. And what made it so devastating wasn't just what I heard. It was what I saw when I stepped into that living room. My little girl, Everly, was trapped inside a large cardboard box, shaking and sobbing, while a man I had never met in my life loomed over her with a roll of packing tape in his hand. On the couch sat my own mother, arms folded, laughing. And standing in the kitchen doorway was my younger sister, phone raised, recording every second of it like she was directing her own viral moment. I need to back up and explain how I even ended up in that situation, because it didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of dysfunction, years of making excuses, and years of believing that blood automatically meant loyalty. I grew up in a home that could have been a case study in what not to do. My father was barely a presence. I have one hazy memory that might be him giving me a piggyback ride on a beach somewhere, but honestly, it could have just as easily been a neighbor. He was that irrelevant to our daily lives. My mother, Betty, was physically present more often than he was, but emotionally and practically, she was absent in ways that were far more damaging. While other kids' moms were packing school lunches and showing up to parent-teacher nights, mine was out with friends, which was always a polite way of saying she was at a bar, drinking herself into another fog. I learned very early that no one was going to take care of my little sister Alana except me. By the time I was 8 years old, I was packing her preschool bag every morning, making her breakfast, putting her to bed at night, and lying awake wondering whether Mom would come home at all. Sometimes she did, sometimes she didn't. When I turned 18, my mother didn't even bother with a proper exit. She simply stopped showing up. No farewell conversation, no explanation, no forwarding address. She just evaporated. Alana was 13 at the time, still a kid with braces and big energy and absolutely no idea how to navigate a world without a parent. I went to court and filed for legal guardianship. The judge looked at me across a courtroom table, took in the fact that I was barely an adult myself, and said plainly that the options were foster care or me. I chose her. I gave up any dreams I had of going to college, got a job at a front desk that eventually led me to paralegal work, and I poured everything I had into keeping us both afloat. The house, the groceries, the daycare, the community college tuition, all of it came from my paycheck. For years, I told myself that it was temporary, that Alana would eventually grow into herself, that she would appreciate the sacrifices and start pulling her own weight. But that's not what happened. What happened instead was that Alana grew up believing that my income was a resource she was entitled to, not grateful for, not willing to contribute to, but simply entitled to. When I married Jeremy and then had Everly, the money naturally shifted toward diapers and daycare and all the unglamorous but necessary expenses of raising a baby. Alana took that personally. She would make biting comments, roll her eyes when I bought things for Everly, act like the presence of a baby in the house was a direct insult to her. Jeremy grew increasingly frustrated with the dynamic. He and I argued about it more times than I can count. Eventually, he gave up arguing and then gave up entirely, leaving me alone with a toddler and a resentful teenage sister who had decided that I was the enemy. I kept telling myself she was just going through something. I kept making space for her behavior because I understood, on some level, that she'd had a hard childhood too. What I failed to see clearly enough was that understanding someone's past doesn't obligate you to accept their cruelty in the present. Things got meaningfully worse when my mother reappeared on the scene. She showed up with that particular brand of warmth that people who have been absent for years sometimes perform, all soft eyes, and talk of reconnection and family healing. I told her clearly that my door was closed. I wasn't angry, not outwardly, but I had learned enough by then to recognize what she was doing. She wasn't there because she'd changed. She was there because Alana represented an access point. A way back into the house, the money, the sense of stability that I had built without her. And Alana, who had never quite let go of the fantasy of having a real mother, welcomed her back with open arms. I tried to be understanding about that too. I knew Alana had been too young to remember the worst of what Betty put us through, the mornings with empty cupboards, the hallways that smelled like vomit, the couch soaked through with cheap vodka. To Alana, our mother was a soft blur, someone who might have been better if given the chance. I let it go. I even let it go when I discovered that Alana had been quietly passing some of my money along to Betty. Small amounts, but consistent. Enough to keep Betty nearby, enough to keep feeding the illusion of a reunion. I should have drawn a harder line then. Instead, I kept making excuses and kept hopping. Then my appendix decided it was done tolerating all of this, and I ended up in the emergency room. The surgery itself was straightforward. My doctor said everything went smoothly, and that I could be discharged as soon as I could stand without collapsing. What was not straightforward was the anxiety that sat in my chest the entire time I was in that hospital bed. A nagging, persistent unease about Everly being home with Alana. I told myself I was being paranoid. Alana could be immature and selfish, but she wouldn't actually hurt a child. She wouldn't take things that far. I had been wrong about a lot of things in my life, but I had never imagined I could be this catastrophically wrong about that. I called a cab and went home a day early. I let myself in quietly, and the first thing I registered was a man's voice, someone I didn't know, with a tone I didn't like. Then the crying started. Then the screaming. I crossed that living room in seconds, and what I found will never fully leave me. Everly was inside a large cardboard box that had the words, "Baby Factory Returns," written on it in thick black marker. The box reached almost to her chest, so she couldn't climb out on her own. Her face was streaked with tears, her hands were gripping the sides of the box, and her eyes held the kind of pure animal panic that no 4-year-old should ever have to experience. The man with the packing tape was standing over her, grinning. A nightmarish animatronic doll on the floor was spinning its head in slow circles and repeating in a hollow voice, "I'm a good girl. I'm a good girl." My mother was on the couch, laughing. My sister was filming. I said stop, just one word, flat and cold, and everything in the room froze. I didn't look at any of them after that. I went straight to my daughter, lifted her out of the box, and held her while she sobbed into my neck. Her little heart was hammering so fast I could feel it through her pajamas. I told her she was safe. I told her nobody was taking her anywhere. I told her Mama had her. And with every word I said to comfort her, something inside me went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before a person decides they are completely done. I told the man to leave. He did, immediately. I looked at my mother and my sister and I said what I needed to say without raising my voice above what Everly could hear. Betty tried to play it off as harmless fun. Alana shrugged. I took Alana's phone out of her hand before she could stop me, found the video, and sent it to my email. Then I told Betty she had 10 minutes to gather her things and leave, and I made clear to Alana that she had 1 hour to pack what she could carry, because whatever was still in her room after that was going in the trash. They pushed back. They always push back, but they left. And when the door closed behind them, the house was finally, blessedly silent. That night, after Everly fell asleep still clutching her stuffed bunny, I made myself watch the video. I needed to see all of it, not just the part I had walked into. What I watched confirmed what I had already suspected. This was not a spontaneous, poorly judged prank. It was premeditated. Betty had set up the box before Everly was brought into the room. The man had been invited specifically. The doll had been purchased and wound up. Alana had positioned herself with her phone to get the best angle. They had planned this together, thought it through, and executed it while my child cried and begged them to stop. Watching Everly's face in that footage, the genuine terror, the desperate screaming, the way her little legs kicked when the man picked her up, I understood with complete clarity that this was not something I could absorb and move past. This was not a situation that warranted forgiveness and a family conversation. This was abuse. Documented, deliberate abuse of a 4-year-old child. The next morning I brought the video to a colleague at the office, a lawyer whose opinion I trusted. He watched it once, looked up at me, and said that what I had on tape qualified as child endangerment in the state of Texas. He said I had grounds for a restraining order and that criminal charges were a real possibility. That afternoon, Everly and I went to the police station. I filed the report, submitted the video as evidence, and answered every question as calmly and clearly as I could. One of the officers was professional and thorough. The other seemed like he would have preferred to be doing literally anything else. I looked that second officer directly in the eye and told him that my daughter cried in her sleep now, flinched at loud noises, and trembled at the sound of men's voices she didn't recognize. This was not a noise complaint. This was a crime against a child. The temporary restraining order was approved within days. The phone calls started almost immediately after the official letters went out. Alana called first, voice climbing into full panic. Betty called next, leading with guilt. Randy, the man from the hoodie, Betty's boyfriend, called last, trying to negotiate, suggesting we could settle this without involving the courts. Each time someone deployed the pity card, I ended the call. I had no pity left. I had spent every last drop of it on my daughter. I thought the restraining order would be the end of the immediate crisis, but I underestimated how little they respected legal documents. A few days after Everly returned to preschool, just a few hours a day, just to give her some normalcy and time with other children, I got a call from her teacher. Alana had shown up at the daycare. She had been allowed in because she used to pick Everly up sometimes. By the time I got there, Everly was standing in the coat room holding her backpack like a shield, her face pale, her eyes huge. Alana had apparently been trying to smooth things over, telling Everly it had all been a misunderstanding, a joke, that she loved her and missed her. The teacher hadn't realized how distressing this was for Everly until she saw my daughter flinch when Alana tried to hug her. That night, Everly had nightmares so severe that she was whispering, "Don't take me. Please don't take me," in her sleep while I sat by her bed and held her hand until morning. I called a child psychologist first thing the next day. The therapist who agreed to see Everly was gentle and patient, and her assessment was clear. Everly's symptoms were consistent with trauma. Nightmares, separation anxiety, fear responses to triggers, hypervigilance. These were not the temporary effects of a bad day. These were the signs of a child whose sense of safety had been fundamentally shaken. I asked the therapist to provide a written report for the court proceedings, because I needed the record to reflect not just what had been done, but what it had cost. I also filed a motion for a full protective order against Alana, including everything: the original video, documentation of past incidents of negligence and cruelty toward Everly, the preschool confrontation, and the psychologist's report. The judge approved it quickly. Alana was now legally prohibited from contacting us in any form. A single violation would result in criminal charges. I should have felt safer after that. Instead, I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who knows that legal documents only protect you from people who respect the law. A few days later, on a completely ordinary walk home from the grocery store, I saw all three of them, Betty, Alana, and Randy, waiting outside my building. I turned on the voice recorder on my phone without breaking my stride. Betty started talking the moment I got close enough. Randy stepped toward me, grabbed my shoulder, and told me to drop the charges or I would regret it. His grip was hard enough to bruise. Everly, who was right there beside me, started screaming. I shielded her with my body and told him to let go. He didn't, not immediately. Betty grabbed my other arm. In that moment, I was aware of two things simultaneously: the pain in my shoulder and the sound of my daughter coming apart with fear right next to me. What saved us from it escalating further was a woman on a porch across the street who had been watching the whole thing unfold and had her phone out. She called across to us that she'd been filming and that the police were already on their way. A man appeared beside her, said he'd called too. Randy released me. His expression shifted, still furious, but calculating now, aware that the situation had changed. Betty pulled him away. Alana stood there for a moment longer, like she might say something, then turned and followed them without looking back. The neighbor sent me her footage. I went to the police station again the next morning with everything: the new video, the audio recording, the neighbor's statement, the psychologist's report, and the officer I spoke with told me plainly that assault, criminal threats, and witness intimidation were all on the table. The trial itself was quieter than I expected. I said what I needed to say. Alana cried. Betty argued. Randy sulked. The sentences came down in flat, official language. Alana received 4 months for her role in the original incident. Betty received 8 months for her participation in the emotional abuse and her involvement in the assault outside my building. Randy received 18 months for putting a child in a box, for physically attacking me, and for making explicit threats. I didn't feel like celebrating when those sentences were read. I felt something closer to exhaustion and relief, the specific relief of knowing that, for a defined period of time, my daughter and I were safe. That was 6 months ago. The house is quiet now in a way it has never been quiet before. It is the good kind of quiet, the kind that comes from the absence of tension, not the absence of life. Everly plays in the living room. She sings to herself while she colors. She asks when we're going back to the zoo. She still has occasional nightmares, but now she has the language to describe what she's afraid of, and she has a safe space to work through it with her therapist. She laughs out loud again. Real, unguarded belly laughs, the kind that remind you why any of this was worth fighting for. Alana was released after serving 1 month. She called, tried to reopen the guilt loop, asked for money. I hung up. She posted something on social media about how her sister ruined her life. I didn't respond. I don't know where Betty is now, and I genuinely don't need to. I'm not tracking her movements or waiting for the next crisis. I'm living my life. I'm present for my daughter. We bake cookies on weekends. We take walks. We read bedtime stories, and she falls asleep against my shoulder, and I sit there in the quiet and feel something I haven't felt in years, which is simply peace. There is something I have learned through all of this that I wish I had understood much earlier. That loyalty to family is not the same thing as loyalty to people who harm you and your child. I spent years softening the edges of other people's cruelty because they were blood, because I understood their history, because I kept hoping they would eventually become the people I needed them to be. What I know now is that family is not defined by shared DNA or shared childhood trauma. Family is defined by who shows up for you, who protects your child, who would never in 1,000 years put your 4-year-old in a box and film her crying for content. The moment I stopped extending grace to people who didn't deserve it, I created space for something better, a home that actually feels like one.